This episode of the show is brought to you from the Salesman.org HubSpot studio. Coming up on today's episode of the Sales Leadership Show.
A lot of companies or people in general were not used to because there was no physical separation between work life and home life. So now you kind of have the two overlapping with each other. When doing B2B business, everything now becomes digitized. So for the businesses that were very reliant on more face-to-face type of interactions, going to trade shows and conferences. So how could we motivate someone so that their brains on a neurochemical level or neuroscience level releases dopamine more?
Hello Sales Nation, my name is Will Barron and I'm the host of the Sales Leadership Show. On today's episode we have the return of Felix Cao. You can find him over at happybuyingbrain.com, and Buying Brains is exactly what we're talking about on today's episode. How the buying brain has changed because of COVID-19 and how it's probably going to change again moving forward into what we're all calling the new normal. Everything that we talk about is available in the show notes over at salesleadership.org. And so with that said, let's jump right into it. Felix, welcome to the Sales Leadership Show.
Hi, Ro. How are you doing today? Thank you so much for having me back on your podcast. It's definitely a pleasure for sure.
You're more than welcome. It's a pleasure for me to have you back on. Okay, so we're going to talk about the buyer's brain in this episode. We're going to talk about whether things have changed, whether things are permanent, and a whole bunch of things. But I want to ask you as open-ended question as I possibly can to get us started. So it's a conversation as opposed to me kind of subtly nudging you one way or the other, because I genuinely want to get your thoughts on this. So let me ask you this, Felix. How has the buyer's brain changed over the past 12, 18 months with COVID? And hopefully we're on the backside of some of this now. How has it changed? And I guess you can add a layer on top of that of, has it changed in a way that you expected?
That's a very good question. I think there's a lot of, the way it's changed for sure is there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of fear. When you combine that with the uncertainty, it certainly leads to anxiety during the buying process. Also on both sides. So you have the salesperson and also the person that they're doing business with on the other side as well. And especially with, all the media and everything that's happening. So when you combine that level of anxiety kind of with watching with all the chaos that's happening around, what that actually leads to is panic as well. So when that happens, actually, the cortex, or which is responsible for your logical or more rational thinking part of the brain, it actually goes offline, right? So, so in that case, we resort back to, we talked about this on one of your earlier podcasts, is the primal brain. So that's more responsible for like your fight or flight response. So, a lot of people in the business world are kind of in that space where the primal brain is in this heightened state of activity, where it's trying to figure out what to do with all this turbulence and kind of chaos that's really happening. And a lot of that has kind of shifted the attention to more of a protective survival mode. And then, so really, in terms of the sales process, how that works, it's really affected people on multiple levels. First of all, it's more on an individual level, especially with the whole remote working. That's something that's a model that a lot of companies or people in general were not used to because there was no physical separation between work life and home life. So now you kind of have the two overlapping with each other, and there's certain challenges that come out of that on an individual level. Now it's something that not only do you have certain tasks now to do in your work, but you have to now balance that out with your, the things that you have to actually do at home. So that's one thing that in terms of the B2B sales, a lot of people in business are actually, looking to handle. And of course, one of the things that come out of that is procrastination, for example. So it's just finding effective ways to deal with how do you actually motivate yourself to, have some sort of structured schedule to continue doing your work. And then on a level on top of that is, if there's in a company, how do you maintain the company culture and keep it intact when you have workers now that are working from home? So that was a challenge that to keep the morale up, especially during this time, is a challenge. And then when doing B2B business, everything now becomes digitized. So for the businesses that were very reliant on more face-to-face type of interactions, going to trade shows and conferences, now their role has turned upside down pretty much. So it was more a matter of like, how do you find people online? And then from there on, the whole interaction process looked different than what it did offline. So it was more of an adapting period on that end. So it it was kind of like this host of different areas of business that kind of got affected at one time. And a lot of that, of course, rooted into, what had happened over the last 12 months or so. So it was just finding effective ways to make those adjustments during the way.
As you say that, Felix, I know this, but I've never really pondered on it. And as you talk about these different layers of both buyers have been affected, sellers have been affected, the company culture has been affected, communication within the organization has been effective. Well, we talk about at the leadership level, we talk about it all the time. We talk very flippantly about an organization isn't buying, an industry has changed, this and this. But it's all made up of individual people, right? If an organization isn't buying, it's because that's group, this symbiotic just consciousness of individuals. It's because they're all slightly panicked, and that leads to the end result. So is there any ways we can think about B2B sales from that perspective of maybe we don't just need to change one person's mind, we don't need to get one person out of a panic mode? Do we need to think bigger picture here of if we're selling to a large organization, there's just tons of stakeholders that are affecting this, whether we realize it or not?
Right. I think the main thing is the whole leadership factor. So the way that, as you mentioned, it's the culture and the collective factor of all these minds coming together. And really, is this kind of when the interaction part looks, especially during the last 12 months, it's more of a relationship of empathy, understanding where they're coming from. I think that's the main thing, as we see in in the world of business, is empathy selling. So there's a lot more of that certainly happening, understanding that they're dealing with challenges that nobody has ever dealt before as we go through this kind of like this crazy adjustable time, transitional time in our history. So in terms of, being effective at that time, is this being able to show that leadership to guide, the person that you're looking to do business with, in terms of helping them go through the process of the sales. And also one of the major things is being able to be patient. I think that's the number one thing, because right now, especially with our primal brains being in that state of uncertainty and anxiety, one of its core features is to want things in the now, right? So because it wants things in the now, then that forces a lot of or influences the behavior of a lot of people in business and sales to want to really hurry and push the sales process fast, or a lot faster than the buyer is comfortable with moving at the particular moment, especially when understanding their state. They're also in a state to look to maximize their resources as well during this certain time. So it's understanding or having a clear kind of in-depth look into how is the buyer thinking about the situation, like what are they currently going through, what are some of the challenges that were not on the table had we talked prior to COVID, is now things that they're dealing with as an organization, and sometimes even as an individual. And one of the things I personally found is now the interactions are a lot more personable as well, whereas before it'd be it'd be like a short period of small talk, get to know each other, and then dive into the business. But now, because of the isolation and the loneliness, people are looking for any form of pretty much human interaction, if you want to call it, because that seems to be something that's very lacking in today's society. So just the fact that they have the opportunity, or we have the opportunity to have a meaningful conversation, there seems to be a lot more time spent in getting to know the person on an individual level, and eventually that's just to morph itself into the business side of things. So the relationship building is certainly something that has changed during the last 12 months. That's what, from my personal experience, I found, and also talking to other people in business as well.
For sure. That makes total sense. And when you talk about the buyer and even the seller and myself and yourself, everyone being in this, even if it's to a small scale, this panic state, are you talking very literally here of we're in I get these confused, but your sympathetic versus parasympathetic nervous systems? Are we talking very literal of people are going to the office, being in fight and flight, and hopefully they come home from the office and they've got the family around them, they can relax and they can turn that off? Or are we talking more from a perspective of mindset of I don't want to screw up right now because I might lose the company money, it might make me look bad, and it's a bad job market? Are we talking very physical, that people feel panicked at a deep level, or is this almost a thought process and a mindset that these individuals are in?
That's a good question, Will. So it's a matter of both. So when the primal brain becomes activated, so you're in the fight or flight, or a person's in a fight or flight. So physiologically, their body is actually responding to that. So they're releasing, stress hormones. They're releasing adrenaline, for example. And, there's a region of the brain that actually becomes highly activated when, fear kicks in. So that the part of the brain is called the amygdala for people who are interested in kind of brain biology. So on a physiological level, certainly there's a state where physically somebody feels or their body changes where they're actually adapting or preparing to handle that new change or that threat or that perceived situation where they may feel more in danger. And that ties in with the psychological part where now the mindset is, I have these certain targets, for example, to hit. And then, the mental stresses that come with, the uncertainty is, are these goals going to be met? So you kind of have these two connections, and the brain is actually on a neuroscience level actually connected on that level. So you have the interaction between the primal brain, which deals with like the emotional side of being human, and also the logical side, which, as you mentioned, is more of the mental side and psychological side. So there's neural connections that go both ways during those interactions when the primal brain is interacting with the logical brain. So it's almost inseparable that when somebody feels, some sort of either psychological or physiological stress, that it's going to penetrate and affect different areas of their well-being as well.
Yeah, I know this for myself personally. When all this kicked off, regular listeners will know my partner is an NHS doctor, and so she was right in the thick of it all.
Oh,
and
excellent.
she'd come home from work and be saying, "This is happening, this is happening." She'd be giving me the rundown, and then we'd be looking at the news and go, "Well, the news is slightly different tale to what's actually happening in reality." And I've talked about this before, but I just shut down for a week. For a week, I was just like, right, I've got enough cash in the bank to last a couple of years now. The business is going to be fine. I don't know what to do. And it was only, this is ridiculous in hindsight, but it was only looking at the books, looking at the accounts at the end of that month that I was like, oh, we've actually done more revenue over the past 7 days, 14 days than what we usually do.
That's
we
excellent.
were just randomly, we were set up, online training during the middle of the pandemic. We were set at the right place at the right time. So where I'm going with this is, I didn't look at the evidence. I made an assumption, acted on the assumption, did nothing, lost a week of my life just slobbering around, feeling sorry for myself, when the evidence in front of me was very clear that we were doing great and we were going to continue to do great up until this moment in time as we were just ahead of the game with a lot of the training that we were offering online, right? So how do we, say like we're sat in a room with a potential buyer and we know that they're feeling fearful, but all of the evidence in front of us, Felix, say we're a sales leader, we've come in on this deal and we're coaching the salesperson through it, and we're engaging with the executives on the other side of the room as well. All of the evidence points to the fact that this deal is a good deal for everyone involved, but the buyer's being particularly pessimistic. They're in this state of panic, fear, or anxiety. Is there anything we can do to talk them out of it or convince them that what they're experiencing right now is not an effective way to move forward?
That's a great question. I think the number one thing, as you mentioned, at certain times the emotions take over, you mentioned, but then the data actually proves otherwise. Like in your situation, for example, well, for that 1 week, even though at that time there might have been a mixture of different feelings in terms of what to do moving forward. However, when you look at all your information in front of you, the data was actually showing that things were going a lot better than what's going on in the mind. I think that's the main thing, is to recognize what's really going on in terms of what the person is thinking and feeling. So on a logical level, perhaps they figured out that, oh, it's, the information looks like we're moving the company in the right direction. But the part to really deal with is, once again, that primal brain, because the primal brain, that's where the subconscious mind lives, and it influences up to 95% of our decision making. And that's part of the reason why a lot of people, during this transition period, especially at the very beginning, felt very stagnant in terms of what actions they should be pursuing, and that led to a lot of procrastination. And I think it's just a matter of understanding what's causing that type of uncertainty in their business, and that's the biggest thing, is knowing that it's what's going to motivate them really to take the next point of action. Of course, motivation is tied to a brain chemical in our minds called, or in the brains anyways, called dopamine. So what can we do to create a situation where it allows the buying brain, for example, to kind of release these the 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 motivation or reward, or that, as it goes by many names, but it's pretty much involved in motivation, anticipation, novelty, curiosity. So how could we motivate someone so that their brains on a neurochemical level or neuroscience level releases dopamine more? And right now there's a misalignment in the buyer's brain between short-term goals versus long-term goals. So right now they understand that, okay, logically, so their logical brain sees the data, understands that this is potentially good for them or is good for them. But then you have the primal brain, which wants things now and maybe cannot. It doesn't come to the conclusion that doing this deal will benefit them at this particular moment. So there's this constant struggle between like the logical brain and the rational side of the brain that plans everything, and the primal brain, which wants things on a now kind of impulsive moment to moment level. So the key here would be to how do you align the values of the leader or the company in terms of both its to get pretty much the primal brain and the logical brain on the same page, right? And one way to do that, of course, is to take some of a bigger goal and to break it down to smaller goals. So then now it satisfies the primal brain because it gets things, it's satisfying the good feeling in the now, and and then it also and then it also satisfies the logical brain, which is more the long-term gain that the company will gain in the the long term or the distant future, if you want to call it. So there's different ways to do that. More of the long term is more future pacing. So that's this kind of tying the products and services with the desired outcome of owning the product and services that you provide. And then the short term gains are of course all the stepping stones that will allow that company to achieve that longer term goal. So so really that's what we found is to be very effective in that sense of combating or actually alleviating a lot of those initial fears and emotions that are in conflict with the kind of like logical brain, which is the more data driven side of things.
Does trust on a human to human level, as opposed to I trust the brand that I'm working for, does that become more or less important in these kind of sales where perhaps the buyer is feeling anxious, is feeling risk averse? And what I mean by that is, should we focus on building, if we had to do one or the other? Clearly the answer is both. If we had to do one or the other, is the answer to focus on the relationships that we have with the individuals in the account, call them up, just ask them how it's going, see if we can help them in general? Or the alternative of that, perhaps, should we really double down on data, statistics, things that we know, evidence that we know proves that the value that we can bring to them?
I think this, going back for your last example, so if in that interaction, if let's say the salesperson really just truly focused on the data, then that would be only speaking to the logical part of the brain, which only influences 5% of the decision-making process. So that's, in that situation, the primal brain of the buyer is the true decision maker. So that's the part of the brain that needs to be focused on. And if that part of the brain is ignored, then it doesn't matter how much data and statistical facts or figures that we want to go over and try to convince them on a logical level. It's more likely than not going to be met with failure, unless the person is, because there's obviously different types of people. Some people are really, let's say if someone's dealing with a CFO, then they all deal in numbers, for example. So that would be a person where, the approach have to be adjusted, where it caters more to their way of thinking and doing business. But for a lot of people, it's usually guided by their emotions. So that's the one thing that if it's, because nobody ends up waking up and goes, well, I don't think about doing it, like I don't feel like doing it, right? And that's why there's a certain ring to it, and it's a much more common saying is because is that primal brain with emotions that really dictates what the person or will heavily influence their behaviors and their actions. So when a salesperson is actually dealing with or in a conversation with another with a buyer, for example, then certainly that relationship and also like ways of finding common interests and even sharing stories is a way to um, connect with a person on that subconscious level or primal level, which is so important because that will, really galvanize the relationship. And then from there on, that's when they're going to be more receptive to your data and facts and everything else that the person wants to speak about.
Sure. You took the words out of my mouth there, Felix, because something I've experienced this year, and this is an N=1 experiment, so is somewhat worthless other than an anecdote on the podcast, is that I have a lot more people coming to me, and when people sign up to our training product, there's a kind of a form that they fill in after the fact of why they chose us and all this kind of thing. And a lot of the data shows that people had a feeling that we would be able to improve their careers and improve their sales success. Less so than what it used to be, seemingly. And again, we need 100,000 people sign up to really double down on this data. But from a surface level, a lot of people previous was like, well, I enjoyed this webinar, and you said you would do this, and this was the outcome that I was expecting. There's a lot more. I like you as a person. I like that kind of training that you do. I like your style. A lot more. Positives coming from an emotional standpoint as opposed to more logical things. So the question I'm asking you, Felix, is to reverse engineer what we've done here, because inadvertently we've done something that works, but I'm not sure how we've done it. How do you think that, without knowing the business too well, for the audience to be clear, how do you think that we've engineered, or how might you engineer this extra level of trust, of rapport that seemingly does initiate the primal brain and does initiate these buying conversations?
Yeah, I think the main thing is right now, and we touched on this earlier as well, is that due to the whole situation over the last 12 months, everybody, or the crisis, everybody's in this kind of state where they're feeling much more isolated and lonely as prior to the whole COVID situation. So just being able to foster that relationship and just to talk to people, I think that's the biggest thing that people are looking for in terms of building trust, is and also touching on probably subjects that would normally not be discussed about, especially on the first meeting, since people are now open to having more deeper conversations. So as you mentioned, people were coming to you, Will, and it was more kind of feeling based. Like I like Will, and I had a feeling that this is going to happen, rather than prior to this entire crisis. People were kind of looking at the data and not saying that, well, seeing things from more of a cause and effect relationship in that fact. But now it's more like, oh, like who's Will, for example? I like his values. I like what he stands as a person, and that is something that actually, on a totality level, when you look at it, it's more than just a relationship level. Even brands as a total have to become. They couldn't just do what they're doing before and say that, oh, we're better than everyone else because this is our features and benefits and so forth. Now, because of all the changes around us with all, let's say, the social injustice and everything, now brands actually have to change their positioning so that they have to now acknowledge all these societal issues and position themselves as the solution to actually solve these societal issues as well. So the same thing here is when two people are interacting in the sales process, it's a matter of just more than looking at just how the brand's going to help them, but who's this individual, for example? Like, is this a person that I want to do business with? And it becomes more even heightened now because of due to the whole lack of in-person or face-to-face meetings. So people are craving that type of interactions, and the people in business that understand that that's such a huge void that's missing, and to come in to fill that void is going to build that trust and rapport with the with the buyer or the partner that they want to do business with.
And I'll frame this up from a personal perspective, and I'm sure I don't know if you have data points off the top of your head, but we can always add them to the show notes after the fact. But how effective are all these like social campaigns that brands do for Black Lives Matter, women in the fair play for women in the workplace, all these different things that are somewhat timely? But it seems like a lot of the time, from my opinion, and this is an opinion, brands will jump on them and they're so like clear that they're just trying to get attention as opposed to they actually care about these kind of things. One brand that I do believe in is Patagonia. They seem to do great things. They use recyclable materials, and they do. There's lots of like social levels to the even just the content that they produce on and the media side of the company. I mean, they do a really good job on multiple fronts. So I'm happy to buy and spend more on Patagonia clothing. But 99% of other campaigns, I look at them and it makes me feel slightly sick as I see them. So from a leadership perspective, when we're shaping the conversations that our teams are having with a buyer, and we're shaping the conversations that we're putting out into the marketplace, is the data that shows that those campaigns and those kind of conversations actually work?
I believe that they do. Like right now, we do, of course, have to look at the data. But right now, people are looking to connect with either other individuals or brands that share the core values that they do, especially in today's time when people are reevaluating their core values pretty much on an everyday basis due to all the different things that are happening around the world. So it's very important for brands to show that they, and that's the thing is that's kind of like the holy grail is for the person or the brand to show that they actually care and it's actually authentic, right? So I really think for example, one example is Uncle Ben's. So they're actually changing their entire logo so that it's in line with more of the social, it respects the social equality or inequality movement. So that's a huge move. A lot of brands would not probably consider changing, logo that has been such a prominent and salient cue for their brand to recognize, especially on the shelves. And just the fact that they're changing it shows that they do care, because we're talking about a logo that people have recognized for over 100 years. So that's something that simply by looking at their actions and the changes that they're looking to participate in, then that's something that shows that it's more than just, oh, this is what's happening today, so we're going to kind of jump on that bandwagon, and then and hopefully everything turns out right, and then the next thing you know, they're doing something else. So this is something that shows that they're willing to take a part of the history and now blend it with what's currently happening in order to create a much more strong connections with their consumer, for example.
So I'm hearing congruence, being authentic, and I guess this comes from the top down, right? This comes from a leadership perspective. This is company culture that we're talking about, isn't it?
Oh, 100%. I think in anything, when we look at it, it's usually the people at the front are, they're really representing all levels of, the company, and a lot of those attributes are learned from the top. Right, so it's learned through interaction, relationships, training, and showing respect, and also having high standards. So if that doesn't start with the leadership group, then what ends up happening, and we've probably seen this happen in a lot of organizations, is that the culture and the fabric that keeps everything together becomes unwind. So when that happens, there's a lot of dissonance in terms of communication. So usually the biggest sign of when things are not working is a breakdown communication, and that's also in a one-to-one type of interaction, all the way through to a collective conscience of individuals that make up an organization, for example. And it's up to the leadership team to actually now set those high standards and to guide almost like the ship in terms of the direction of where it wants to head it to, rather than it's kind of sit back and let people do what they want to do, and before you know it, there's a million different opinions of where things want to go, and then there's no clear direction, and that's when you have people making choices that may not be the best for either themselves and especially for the organization as a whole moving forward.
For sure. Okay, so I want to wrap up on this final idea of there's probably multiple metaphors that we can use of when people are battered and bruised for 18 months. Do they become hardened and calloused? Are they less likely to become more optimistic in the future? Are we literally scarring or not literally, but figuratively scarring our brains here and making them more rigid? Or is there a level of plasticity to all this? Can we bounce back from this? I know it's subjective, but is the market likely, if the logical elements of the market changed, it was a good time to spend money, would we bounce back, or are we wired as humans to keep that resource holding and perhaps be pessimistic for longer than what the facts tell us?
Well, I think right now, I think the main thing is the brain is very resilient and it's able to adapt to new situations. As we're seeing it right now, companies that were relying mainly on, more of the face-to-face interaction, now they're really, forced to move into the online world. So we have this kind of collision or this kind of hybrid of doing business now that involves both the offline and then the online kind of coming together. So the experiences coming out of this is going to be one that's going to be, one that's a combination of the two. So how does someone prospect now? Before, they used to be able to go to a live event. Now how do they do it in this virtual world and find events where people are sitting, let's say in some sort of conference call? How do they do business where they're used to doing business locally because they can meet with that person in a coffee shop? Now their business reach is almost limitless. So now they could do business with somebody that's halfway across the country or maybe around the world. So there's certainly a lot of positive aspects to look at this. So in a lot of ways, it's how do people continue to become motivated? How do they get out of the mode of being of feeling a procrastination? Also building that level of mental toughness. How do they find structure in this new digitized world, plus balancing this work and home life, right? So moving forward, I think it's very, very exciting, is that simply because the whole digitization of the business world, this opens up plenty or limitless opportunities, as we've seen with the internet in the early 2000s, that especially for, let's say, e-commerce, that blew everything up, right? So you had eBay, you had Amazon, and then with mobile phones, it was the same thing. So instead of waiting to come home and then check your email or looking to browse, your favorite e-commerce site, now everything was actually executed on a phone. Let's say on a subway ride to home, or maybe just while watching TV or something like that. So I think it's certainly exciting times. What's going to be happening, especially when this hybrid model kicks in with the doing business with the online plus the offline world.
How long, it might have happened already, how long do you think it will take for the buying brain, literal brains inside the buyer's heads, right, to go, okay, this isn't, we use the word the new normal all the time. This isn't the new normal anymore. This is just how it is. How long until you think, Felix, that we don't have this conversation about change anymore? We're just back to the new status quo.
That's a great question. I don't know if anyone really has the true answer to that. I think right now everybody's still trying to figure out how do they navigate, quote unquote, through this new normal. But I think what everybody will probably agree on is that the way of doing business or life in general has changed over the last 12 months for sure. In the world of business, if we just focus on that, that's a lot of the interaction will be in person, plus conference calls as well. So it's the interactions will certainly be different in that respect. That will impact obviously the sales cycle, also relationship building, also team building, also acquiring talent will be one of the major things. Now somebody doesn't have to rely locally. They could actually, let's say, now it's an option to explore talent of people that is, let's say, in a different country that they may not have discovered due to the whole digitization process. So in terms of a timeline, there's really no timeline until we, is this something that we just have to navigate the best that we can during this period of change, and then while being agile and flexible, that will allow us to transition much more smoothly into whatever this new normal or regular normal will be once we come out of this.
I'm going to go on the record here, Felix. I will have you back on in the future to review me going on the record. So we're still in the UK, we're still in lockdown right now, and there's 27 different stages and different criteria need to be hit for these things to happen and these things to happen. I've lost track of all the dates that stuff's supposed to be happening. But my prediction is a year after lockdown ends and there's no rules for social distancing, stadiums can be full. I think a year after that, we'll have totally forgotten about all of this, and we might have new habits and new ways of doing things. But that'll just be the new norm for the next 10 years until we get hit by a meteorite, until the next pandemic, until something else happens.
Right.
I genuinely really, I feel like I could pull some data to back some of this up, but it's more of a feeling, right? And my experience that we just forget stuff. We're so like short minded. Our mental history just as humans is just so short of when we've got stuff to do. If something happened last week, we're over it most of the time. So I genuinely, maybe this is me being a massive optimist, but I do feel like a year after that date that I can go to a football match in a full stadium and watch Liverpool get beaten because they're doing rubbish at the moment. At that point, we'll have just forgotten about a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, that's very possible. I think, some people will forget it, but I think the feeling that comes with what we had gone through will stay with a lot of people. And that's something that, as we talked about, sometimes you forget about what they tell you, but you'll never forget about how they made you feel. And this is like one of the relationships that on a public level, a lot of people have with this whole COVID situation. So we may not remember all the different stages of the lockdown, for example, but we remember how we felt while we were going through it. And that may impact, people's behavior moving out of it. And you know what, the great thing is if it moves back to normal and everybody meets face to face and everything, then that's wonderful. But I think the main thing here is regardless of what direction it moves in, then as people in leadership positions or in business, we're able to adapt to that new situation, no matter if it's pre-COVID or the new normal.
Amazing stuff. Well, with that, Felix, we'll wrap up there, mate. Tell us where we can find out more about you.
Yeah, absolutely. So best places to connect with me on LinkedIn. So if you just type in Felix Cao, then I'm more than happy to connect with people on there. Also on my website at www.happybuyingbrain.com. I have a blog that I post frequently. Then if people are wanting to learn the latest news on the world of neuromarketing and how they could help, level up their business in terms of sales and ROI and marketing, then feel free to subscribe to the blog as well. And of course, you could reach me at felix@happybuyingbrain.com if you want to email me. But LinkedIn would be the ideal place.
Amazing stuff. Well, I'll link to the LinkedIn, the website, everything else that we talked about in this episode of the show over at salesleadership.org. And so with that, Felix, I want to thank you for your time, your insights on this. I love talking about the brain. Clearly, I love this topic. And I want to thank you for joining us on the Sales Leadership Show.
Thank you. Well, I definitely appreciate it. Thank you for having me on the show.